Page 137. One needs to have only 2 points in order to draw a straight line between them. In 1920, as Ehrenberg recalls, the Cheka addressed him as follows: "You prove to us that you are not Wrangel's agent." And in 1950, one of the leading colonels of the MGB, Foma Fomich Zheleznov, said to his prisoners, "We are not going to sweat to prove the prisoner's guilt to him. Let him prove to us that he did not have hostile intent." All along this cannibalistically artless straight line lie collections of countless millions. What a speed up and simplification of criminal investigation. Previously unknown to mankind, the organs altogether freed themselves of the burden of obtaining proof. Trembling and pale, the rabbit who has been caught, deprived of the right to write anyone, phone anyone, bring anything with him from freedom, deprived too of sleep, food, paper, pencils, and even buttons. Seated on a bare stool in the corner of an office, Hart had to try to find out for himself and display to that loafer of an interrogator proof that he did not have hostile intentions. If he could not discover such proof, and where would he find it? By that very failure, he provided the interrogation with approximate proof of his guilt. I knew of a case in which a certain old man who had been a prisoner in Germany managed nonetheless, sitting there on his bare stool and gesturing with his cold fingers, to prove to his monster of an interrogator that he did not betray his motherland, and even that he did not have any such intention. It was a scandal. And what happened? Did they free him? Of course not. After all, he told me about this in Buturki and not on Tverskoy Boulevard in the middle of Moscow. At that point, a second interrogator joined the first, and they spent a quiet evening reminiscing with the old man. The two interrogators signed witnesses' affidavits stating that in the course of the evening, the hungry, sleepy old man had engaged in anti-Soviet propaganda. Things were said innocently, but they weren't listened to innocently. The old man was then turned over to a third interrogator, who quashed the treason indictment and neatly nailed him with that of the very same tenor for anti-Soviet agitation. During his interrogation, given that interrogations had ceased to be an attempt to get at the truth for the interrogators in difficult cases, they became a mere exercise of their duties as executioners, and in easy cases, simply a pastime and a basis for receiving salary. And easy cases always existed, even in the notorious year 1937. For example, Borodko was accused of having visited his parents in Poland 16 years before without having a passport for foreign travel. His papa and mama lived all of 10 versts 6 miles away, but the diplomats had signed away that part of Belarusia to Poland, and in 1921 people had not yet gotten used to the fact and went back and forth as they pleased. The interrogation took just half an hour. Question: did you go there? Answer: I did. Question: how? Answer: on horseback, of course. Conclusion: take 10 years for counter-revolutionary anti-Soviet agitation. But that sort of pace smells of the Stakhanovite movement, a movement which found no disciples among the Blue Caps. According to the Code of Criminal Procedure, every interrogation was supposed to take 2 months, and if it presented difficulties, one was allowed to ask the prosecutor for several continuations of a month apiece, which of course the prosecutor never refused. Thus, it would have been stupid to risk one's health, not to take advantage of these postponements, and, speaking in factory terms, to raise one's work norms. Having worked with voice and fist in the initial assault week of every interrogation, and thereby expended one's will and character as per Wyszynski, the interrogators had a vital interest in dragging out the remainder of every case as long as possible. That way, more old, subdued cases were on hand, and fewer new ones. It was considered just indecent to complete a political interrogation in 2 months. The state system itself suffered from its own lack of trust and from its rigidity. These interrogators were selected personnel, but they weren't trusted either. In all probability, they, too, were required to check in on arriving and check out on leaving, and the prisoners were, of course, checked in and out when called for questioning. What else could the interrogators do to keep the bookkeeper's accounts straight? They would summon one of their defendants, sit him down in a corner, ask him some terrifying questions, and then forget about him for a while they themselves sat for a long time reading the paper, while an outline for political indoctrination courses or personal letters, writing an outline, or went off to visit one another, leaving guards to act as watchdogs in their place. Peacefully batting the breeze on the sofa with a colleague who had just dropped in, the interrogator would come to himself once in a while, look threateningly at the accused and say, "Now there's a rat. There's a real rat for you. Well, that's all right. We'll not be stingy about his 9 grams. My interrogator also made frequent use of the telephone. For example, he used to phone home and tell his wife, with his sparkling eyes directed at me, that he was going to be working all night long, so she mustn't expect him before morning." My heart, of course, felt that meant he would be working me over all night long. But then he would immediately dial the phone number of his mistress and, in purring tones, make a date with her for that night. So I would be able to get some sleep. I felt relieved. Thus it was that the faultless system was moderated only by the shortcomings of those who carried it out. Certain of the more curious interrogators used to enjoy using empty interrogations to broaden their knowledge of life. They might ask the accused prisoner about the front, about those very German tanks beneath which they never quite managed to find the time to throw themselves, or perhaps about the customs of European countries and lands across the sea which the prisoner had visited, about the stores and the merchandise sold in them, and particularly about procedures in foreign warehouses, and about all kinds of adventures with women. The Code of Criminal Procedure provided that the prosecutor was to review continuously the course of every interrogation to ensure it's being conducted correctly. But no one in our time ever saw him face to face until the so-called questioning by the prosecutor, which meant the interrogation was nearing its end. I too was taken to such a questioning. Lieutenant Colonel Kotov, a calm, well-nourished, impersonal blond man, who was neither nasty nor nice, but essentially a cipher, and sat behind his desk and, yawning, examined for the first time the file on my case. He spent 15 minutes acquainting himself with it while I watched. Since his questioning was quite unavoidable, and since it was also recorded, there would have been no sense at all in his studying the file at some earlier, unrecorded time, and then having had to remember the details of the case for a certain number of hours. Finally, he raised his indifferent eyes to stare at the wall and asked lazily what I wanted to add to my testimony. He was required by law to ask what complaints I had about the conduct of the interrogation and whether coercion had been used or any violation of my legal rights had occurred. But it had been a long time since prosecutors asked such questions, and what if they had, after all, the existence of that entire ministry building with its thousands of rooms, and all 5,000 of it the ministry's other interrogation buildings, railroad cars, caves, and dugouts scattered throughout the Soviet Union, was based on violations of legal rights, and it certainly wasn't up to Lieutenant Colonel Kotov and me to reverse that whole process. Anyway, all the prosecutors of any rank at all held their positions with the approval of that very same state security which they were supposed to check up on. His own wilted state, his lack of combativeness, and his fatigue from all those endless stupid cases were somehow transmitted to me. So I didn't raise questions of the truth with him. I requested only that one too obvious stupidity be corrected. I requested only that one too obvious stupidity be corrected. That two of us had been indicted in the same case, but our interrogations were conducted in different places, mine in Moscow and my friends at the front. Therefore, I was processed singly, yet I was charged under Section 11. In other words, as a group, as an organization. As persuasively as possible, I requested him to cancel this additional charge under Section 11. He leafed through the case for another 5 minutes, sighed, spread out his hands, and said, "What's there to say? One person is a person and two persons are people. So 1.5 persons. Is that an organization?" And he pushed the button for them to come and take me away. Soon after that, late one evening in late May, in that same office with a sculpted bronze clock on the marble mantel, my interrogator summoned me for a 206 procedure. This was in accordance with the provisions of the Code of Criminal Procedure, the defendant's review of the case before his final signature. Not doubting for one moment that I would sign, the interrogator was already seated, writing the conclusion on the indictment. I opened the cover of the thick file, and there, on the inside, with the cover in printed text, I read an astonishing statement. It turned out that during the interrogation, I had had the right to make written complaints against anything improper in its conduct, and that the interrogator was obliged to staple these complaints into my record during the interrogation, not at its end. Alas, not one of the thousands with whom I was later imprisoned had been aware of this right. I turned more pages. I saw photocopies of my own letters, and a totally distorted interpretation of their meaning by unknown commentators like Captain Libin. I saw the hyperbolized lie in which Captain Yezhapov had wrapped up my careful testimony. And, last but not least, I saw the idiocy whereby I, one individual, was accused as a group. I won't sign, I said, without which firmness you conducted the interrogation improperly. All right then, let's begin it all over again. Maliciously, he compressed his lips. We'll send you off to the place where we keep the police safe. He even stretched out his hand as though to take the file away from me. At that point, I held on to it. Somewhere outside the fifth-floor windows of the Lubyanka, the golden sunset sun glowed. Somewhere it was May. The office windows, like all the office windows facing outward, were tightly closed and had not yet been unsealed after the winter, so that fresh air and the fragrance of things in bloom should not creep into those hidden rooms. The bronze clock on the mantel, from which the last rays of the sun had disappeared, quietly chimed. Begin it all over again. It seemed to me it would be easier to die than to begin all over again. Ahead of me loomed at least some kind of life. If I had only known what kind. And then, what about that place where they kept the police safe? And, in general, it was a bad idea to make him angry. It would influence the tone in which he phrased the conclusion of the indictment. And so I signed. I signed it complete with Section 11, the significance of which I did not even know. I did not then know. They told me only that it would not add to my prison term. But because of Section 11, I was later put into a hard labor camp. Because of that Section 11, I was sent, even after liberation, without any additional sentence, into eternal exile. Maybe it was all for the best. Without both those experiences, I would not have written this book. My interrogator had used no methods on me other than sleeplessness, lies, and threats, all completely legal. Therefore, in the course of the 206 procedure, he didn't have to shove at me, as did the interrogators who had made a mess of things and wanted to play it safe. A document of non-disclosure for me to sign, that I, the undersigned, under pain of criminal penalty, swore never to tell anyone about the methods used in conducting my interrogation. No one knows, incidentally, what article of the code this comes under. In several of the provincial administrations of the NKVD, this measure was carried out in its sequence. The typed statement of non-disclosure was shoved at a prisoner along with the verdict of the OSO, and later a similar document was shoved at prisoners being released from camp, whereby they guaranteed never to disclose to anyone the state of affairs in camp. And so, our habit of obedience, our bent or broken backbone, did not suffer us either to reject this gangster method of burying loose ends, or even to be enraged by it. We have lost the measure of freedom. We have no means of determining where it begins and where it ends. We are an Asiatic people. On and on they go, taking from us those endless pledges of non-disclosure, everyone not too lazy to ask for them. By now we are even unsure whether we have the right to talk about the events of our own lives. That's the end of the chapter. Thank you for listening. See you again.